Charles Augustus Lindbergh, with his multitude of nicknames, Slim, Lucky Lindy, and the Lone Eagle, was born on February 4, 1902, in Detroit, Michigan, to Swedish immigrant Charles August Lindbergh and his second wife, Evangeline Lodge Land Lindbergh. Although he was born in Detroit, he spent most of his childhood in Little Falls, Minnesota, and Washington, D.C. Lindbergh's father was a Republican congressman in Minnesota, and his mother was a chemistry teacher in Detroit and later at Little Falls High School, where Lindbergh graduated in 1918. After high school, Lindbergh attended the College of Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but he dropped out in the middle of his sophomore year. He then went to Lincoln, Nebraska in March of 1922 to begin his flight training. Lindbergh had become fascinated with flying, even though he had never been close enough to a plane to touch it. Lindbergh enrolled as a student at the Nebraska Aircraft Corporation's flying school, and also flew for the first time on April 9, 1922. In order to gain both much-needed flight experience and money, Lindbergh left Lincoln in June and spent the next few months in various states barnstorming, which is essentially a flying circus where stunt pilots would perform tricks with airplanes, and working as a wing walker, parachutist, and even as an airplane mechanic in Montana at Billings Municipal Airport.
In May of 1919, Raymond Ortigue, a French man in the hotel industry, designated a $25,000 prize to be awarded to the first pilot to make a successful non-stop flight between New York City and Paris. Many took on this challenge, including flying ace Rene Fonck, but none would succeed until Lindbergh, whose efforts were financed by a $15,000 bank loan, a $1,000 donation from his employer as an airmail pilot, and his own savings. It was difficult for Lindbergh to purchase a plane because of his lack of money. However, with the help of the State National Bank of St. Louis, Lindbergh was able to acquire a single-seat, single-engine, high-wing monoplane dubbed the Spirit of St. Louis. Just 2 months after being assembled, the Spirit of St. Louis flew, and after a series of test flights, Lindbergh flew to New York's Long Island. 6 well-known aviators had already perished in pursuit of the Ortigue Prize, but this did not deter Lindbergh from attempting his historic flight. Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis took off from Roosevelt Field on Friday, May 20th, 1927, with 450 gallons of gasoline, 4 red flares, an air raft, 5 cans of army rations, and other various items necessary for survival. Lindbergh's flight was by no means easy. He endured many challenges, such as flying over storm clouds at 10,000 feet and flying over wave tops as low as 10 feet. He also fought icing and blinding fog. After 33.5 hours, Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget Airport in Paris, France. An estimated crowd of 150,000 people viewed the spectacle and caused what came to be called the largest traffic jam in Parisian history. The crowd dragged Lindbergh from the cockpit and literally carried him above their heads for nearly a half an hour. Souvenir hunters did some damage to the Spirit of St. Louis, but the plane was rescued from the mob of people by a group of French flyers, soldiers, and police. Life would never again be the same for the previously little-known former U.S. airmail pilot.
The President of France gave the Legion of Honor, one of the highest decorations in France, to Lindbergh upon his arrival to Paris. Charles Lindbergh stayed in Europe for around a month, where he made a series of flights to Belgium and Great Britain. However, he had to return to America eventually. That day came on June 11, 1927, where Lindbergh returned to the U.S. via the United States Navy cruiser, the USS Memphis. When he returned to the U.S., President Coolidge presented him with the Distinguished Flying Cross, a military decoration which is awarded to an enlisted member of the United States Armed Forces for heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in an aerial flight. Lindbergh's flight was also honored by the U.S. Post Office Department, who issued a 10-cent airmail stamp depicting the Spirit of St. Louis and a map of his flight. 2 days after his arrival, Lindbergh was honored by a parade on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The large amount of publicity surrounding Lindbergh and his flight greatly helped the aviation industry and made people take air travel seriously. and by 1927, the amount of applications for pilot's license in the U.S. tripled. Lindbergh further advanced the aviation industry by developing techniques for high-altitude flying and by demonstrating how to increase flying range by developing techniques of refining flight altitudes and leaning fuel mixtures to decrease the rate of gasoline consumption and improving efficiency. In December, Lindbergh received the Medal of Honor presented by President Coolidge, despite the fact that it was usually only awarded for heroism in combat. Lindbergh would go on to design a watch that would make navigation easier for pilots, which is still produced today. In April 1928, Lindbergh donated the original Spirit of St. Louis to the Smithsonian, where it has been on continuous display in the main lobby of the National Air and Space Museum.
Lindbergh's life would again change on the evening of March 1, 1932, when his 20-month-old son, Charles Jr., was abducted from his crib in his family's home in East Amwell, New Jersey. A 10-week nationwide search for the child was undertaken. Simultaneously, ransom negotiations were being conducted. These negotiations resulted in the payment of $50,000 in cash in exchange for information on the child's whereabouts. However, this information proved to be false, and the child's remains were found by chance by a truck driver 6 weeks after he disappeared in roadside woodlands near Mount Rose, New Jersey. After the tragic event, Congress passed the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal offense under certain circumstances. The sad irony of the situation was that Charles Jr. was found just a few miles from his home. His body was badly decomposed, and the cause of death was deemed a fatal head injury. 2 years of fruitless investigation, due to amateur police mistakes and the leaking of a ransom note to a newspaper, had resulted in 2 suspects committing suicide when the police found a man named Bruno Hauptmann spending the currency paid to the kidnappers. Hauptmann was tried for the murder in court and was found guilty and immediately sentenced to death. Hauptmann was executed on April 3, 1936, on the electric chair appropriately named Oats. Due to the amount of publicity and attention focused on Lindbergh and his family after the trials, Lindbergh became concerned for his 3-year-old son, John's safety. By late 1935, the Lindberghs decided to secretly go into voluntary exile in Europe, which they did by boarding the SS American Importer using passports with fake names. Their destination was Liverpool, England. Before leaving, Lindbergh told Lyman, a longtime friend and aviation editor of the New York Times Magazine, that the reason they left was to seek a safe, secluded residence away from the tremendous public hysteria that surrounded them in America. Upon their arrival in England, they would eventually travel to South Wales to stay with relatives. The Lindbergh family would continue to live in Europe for more than 3 years, where they would also have another child, Land Lindbergh, before returning to the United States.
Lindbergh's historic flight isn't the only thing he is known for. In the 1960s, Lindbergh began to campaign to protect endangered species, specifically the humpback and blue whales. His support of establishing national parks led him to also become involved in efforts to protect the Philippine eagle and the tamaraw. Lindbergh showed his love for both technology and nature and his belief that all the achievements of mankind have value, only to the extent that they preserve and improve the quality of life. Another interest of Lindbergh's was writing. He wrote prolifically on various topics that interested him, such as science, technology, nationalism, war, materialism, and values. Lindbergh also appeared in motion pictures and had movies made about him. One of the most famous was titled The Spirit of St. Louis. He was also the subject of numerous television shows and documentaries. After his historic flight, he was also the subject of various songs written by artists such as Howard Johnson and Al Sherman. Lindbergh was also selected to be the first Time magazine Man of the Year in 1927. To this day, he remains the youngest individual, he was 25 at the time, to receive this distinction. In addition, Lindbergh invented an artificial heart. He developed it for Alexis Carrel, a French surgeon and biologist whose research included experiments in keeping organs alive outside the body. Lindbergh's device could pump the substances necessary for life throughout the tissues of an organ. Lindbergh spent the last years of his life on the Hawaiian island of Maui, where he died of lymphoma on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72.
Charles Lindbergh not only revolutionized the aviation industry, but also crusaded for environmental causes, made important strides in the medical field by helping conceive an artificial heart pump, and influenced movies, television, and music in pop culture. Lindbergh broke barriers by achieving what was once thought to be impossible. Eleanor Smith Sullivan, the winner of the 1930 Best Woman Aviator of the Year award, describes Lindbergh's significance to the aviation industry in this quote: "People seem to think that we, as in aviators, were from outer space or something, but after Charles Lindbergh, we could do no wrong. It's hard to describe the impact that Lindbergh had on people. Even the first walk on the moon doesn't come close. The 20s was such an innocent time, and people were still so religious. I think they felt like this man was sent by God to do this. And it changed aviation forever because all of a sudden the Wall Streeters were banging on doors looking for airplanes to invest in. We'd been standing on our heads trying to get them to notice us, but after Lindbergh, suddenly everyone wanted to fly, and there weren't enough planes to carry them. Because of these reasons and more, Charles Lindbergh deserves the honor of being awarded a place on the APUSH Wall of Fame."